This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week we are going to talk about the Middle East, but we are not going to talk about one set of politics or another this week. We're going to delve deeper. We're going to try to understand what are some of the deeper motivations in this region and how the history of conflict, memory, trauma, and grief between Israelis and Palestinians, how that shapes the current violence and the current suffering in this important but very, very difficult region to understand and live in. We are joined by the person who I think has done the most in the last few decades to elucidate this region, elucidate the violence, the trauma, the suffering in this region. One of my favorite authors on this region, who happens also to be a friend and neighbor here in Austin. This is Lawrence Wright. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker, a playwright, a screenwriter, and an author of 10 books of nonfiction, including, I think, the best book still on September 11th and terrorism in that period, The Looming Tower. He's also written Going Clear, which is a study of Scientology. God Save Texas, which tells you what it's all about just in the title, and many other nonfiction works. He is, in addition to that, an accomplished novelist. He wrote, I think, a very important novel that anticipated the COVID crisis, and a novel that we discussed on this podcast with Larry at the end of October. And most recently, he has just published a fantastic novel that I encourage everyone to read. It is called The Human Scale, and it is on the months and years leading up to October 7th, 2023, and the horrible Hamas attack on Israel that occurred then, and really explores the region and the relationship between settlers in the West Bank and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Larry, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Jeremy.
Before we get into our discussion with Larry Wright of his novel and the region, we have, of course, our scene-setting poem from Mr. Zachary Suri. Zachary, can you give us the title of your poem?
It's called In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. Let's hear it.
I was in Jerusalem once, they tell me, and walked in the footsteps of my fathers and in the footsteps of the city that throws up apples and olives and oranges like one branch with the graftings of every fruit. I was in Jerusalem once. I don't remember, but I crawled on the old cobblestones and whimpered under the rafters of the churches, catching the scent of centuries like dust somewhere in my ancient nose. I was in Jerusalem once, they all say, and all of us have touched that ground as infants, even if at 1 year old, I was actually in a cradle in Madison, Wisconsin, counting the minutes and counting the stars. And in the haze of bullets, when it comes, I think they too must also think, behind the fence or in the shelters, I was in Jerusalem once. I had a home, a heart back then, and next year, may we be there again.
It sort of ends, Zachary, your poem with an invocation from Passover, doesn't it?
Yes. It's a poem about the connection to the sort of small piece of land that so many people feel, even if it's not a place that they've ever been. But it's also about how, for people who live in the region, that question is so much more real. It's a question of home, of heart. And next year in Jerusalem means not just a sort of religious hope, but quite literally, they hope to be back, or they hope to build the kind of society that their forefathers set out to. That's sort of what the poem's about.
Sure. Zachary, if I can interrupt, I thought it was a great poem. I thought it was really very evocative, and also the touch of the warning of violence that's in the air that also accompanies all those images of fruitfulness.
Yeah.
I agree, Zachary. Larry, I think the poem also sets the scene for your novel in a really powerful way. Why did you, after spending so many years studying and writing about this region, why did you decide to write this novel?
I guess frustration, basically. I mean, I've been interviewing people face to face for decades, and yet I still couldn't understand what makes this conflict so durable. I mean, I'm the same age as Israel, actually a few months older. Yes, a young country, Wilmar, we can say anyway. But this has been a part of my life my entire life. And this is, other things have changed. I mean, apartheid in South Africa ended. We elected a black man president. The Soviet Union dissolved. We got through Vietnam. We got through Iraq 1. We got through Iraq 2, Afghanistan. That's all a part of history. But this conflict goes on and on. And after all my study about it, I still felt that I hadn't completely understood what's the motor behind this. And, with nonfiction, there are limitations. But the interesting thing about dealing with it as a novel is that I could get inside the minds and the imagination of my characters, which I'm not allowed to do as a nonfiction writer. But I wanted to see the conflict through the eyes of interesting, appealing, intelligent participants who differ with each other profoundly and who are in the conflict themselves. I feel like if you could see the world through the eyes of your antagonist, you might be able to stumble somewhere along the way to peace. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet.
You capture this so well, and your novel is set in the West Bank, in Kiryat Arba, which is a Jewish settlement, and you have the settlers, you have the Palestinians in the region and elsewhere, and throughout the novel, there's a constant clash between these worlds. And on page 330, I want to quote you. You have one of your characters, Malik, who's an American FBI agent who's now in the region. He's also of Palestinian background himself, though he hadn't been to the region before, according to your plot. And you have him sort of reflecting on this. I wanted to read the paragraph and then get you to react to it, if this is one of the central sort of nubs of your novel. You write, and this is Malik thinking things through. He, Malik, didn't know what to think about the feud between Israel and Palestine. From afar as an Arab, it was easy to make the judgment that it was a simple case of colonialism. But on the ground, it didn't seem so simple. Jews had been there for centuries. They had a legitimate claim on the land. So did the Palestinians. What did it matter who was here first? He, Malik, despised the violent aggression of the settlers, especially the Kahanists, who are important actors in your novel. But he also recognized the threat posed by jihadist groups. He didn't see a moral difference between them, only a power imbalance. The settlers didn't represent all Israelis, nor did Hamas represent all Palestinians. But neither side worked to eliminate the violent actors inside their communities. Instead, the extremists were tolerated, even elected to high office. They served a purpose, and the purpose was to prolong the conflict, justify the hatred, and rid the land of the other. Is that your central? Is that a sort of the central narrative plot in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, in the reality that we face, it's frustrating to think that there's only one solution to this conflict, and that is diplomatic efforts to peace, and everybody knows this. And yet this fantasy on both sides that they can eliminate the other, that they can push the Jews into the sea or send all the Arabs into Jordan and Lebanon and clear off the West Bank and Gaza. Those are fantasies. And yet there will never be a Middle East with only Jews and only Arabs. It will always be a mixture. And it's, part of the puzzle is, why can they live together in peace in Brooklyn?
Yes.
And they can't in their own neighborhood?
Zachary?
Why do you think that is? What is the sort of, what are the like broader historical forces that you see at work that your characters have to wrestle with?
Well, start with history. There's a history on both sides that comes into play and it has them by the throat in a way, won't let them go. For the early immigrants into Israel, it was the Holocaust, that was so shattering and so definitive of what was to come. Then, of course, there was 1948 and 1967, where so many Palestinians were either left and not allowed to come back or forcefully evacuated. 700,000 in 1948. It was, if we could go back in history, there are two things I would change. One, I'd let more Jews come to America. There was a decision in part on part of the Zionists that they were afraid of losing the goodwill of Americans because so many were moving to New York and so on. The other thing I would change is I'd let the Palestinians come home after 1948, and then there might have been a way to work out a mutual way of living together, but because that never happened, there's this possession of the land by the Jews and dispersal of the Arabs. And one of my characters, Sarah, Yossi's daughter, talks about how we are giving the Palestinians Jewish history. And, that's the profound irony that is so tragic in this story.
I was going to refer to that exact passage. Sarah is one of your characters who comes on stage late in the novel, and it seems to me she's the closest to a pure character. Is that fair?
Yeah, I suppose it is. I mean, my depiction of all of these characters is informed by people that I knew, but they're mixtures for the most part, and some are more directly drawn from life than others.
But she's
I wanted someone who exemplified the ambivalence that so many Israelis feel.
You have her saying, "I hate the hatred. Honestly, I can't stand it." And then she says, "Grief. Israel was created by a grieving people. If we had dealt with that, if we had accepted our suffering, we might have found happiness, if such a thing exists for a nation. But we let our grief define us. All this rage, this depression, shame, this insistence on revenge, they're expressions of a grief that is too big for us, too big for any people." And then she says, as you just referred to, we're making the Palestinians in our image.
Yeah.
It's almost, Larry, like you're describing in very evocative terms a cycle of grief begetting more grief.
Well, and this, this current wave of trauma that we're experiencing now, if you're going to look at a lesson from the Middle East, things can always get worse. And the more trauma there is, the more trauma will be created. And, it's stopping that cycle that is so hard. It's not as if it's impossible. It's just hard. And, unfortunately, that region is lacking leaders with any kind of political courage.
Do you see your characters, particularly Yossi and Malik, who are both in different ways in law enforcement, do you see them trying to stop this cycle?
I think their goal is to understand the cycle. Yossi's just lived in it, and he was in the kind of mowing the lawn school of control of Palestine, but he's beginning to see that things are getting out of hand, and all of his efforts to control the violence in the region are failing. So I think Malik presents a real challenge for him because he understands his intelligence. He knows that Malik is a far better cop or, intelligence agent than he will ever be. And he needs him. And it's the first time he has a relationship with somebody, a Palestinian like that he truly admires. And it also upsets him,
Sure.
But he's conflicted because it's once you recognize the humanity of your supposed enemy, it complicates your life, and that's why it's so hard to do.
Absolutely. I think you carry that out very well. I guess it's an old trope in literature that you really bring to life, Larry, of the two partners who really don't like each other but come to gain a deep friendship out of their difference initially, but their common effort to solve a crime in one way or another.
Yeah.
Zachary?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you said that a lot of these characters that you write are based on real life or people that you met. Have you found people in the region who have sort of confronted the ghosts, if you will, in this way? And how do they think about moving forward?
Well, there's one character that I would point to, Zachary, and that is Jamal, who is based on, in large part, on Issa Amro, who is a peace activist in Hebron. When I say peace activist in Hebron, you have to understand that Hebron is one of the most hateful environments I have ever been in. And I started my career at the Race Relations Reporter in Nashville covering the civil rights movement. So conflict, I understand about conflict, but I had never saw it at the level that I saw it in Hebron. And the amount of courage that it took for this really very solitary figure. There's not like a peace movement in Hebron. There is Issa Amro. And he reminds me of a lot of the freedom riders, people like that who knew they were going to be beaten, maybe killed in the pursuit of, some kind of accommodation. But he couldn't be who he is if he didn't think there was hope that peace could be achieved by reaching through the antagonism that separates these two people.
It's interesting because your figure, Jalal, I don't want to give too much away from the plot. I want people to read the novel; they really should. But he's not he's a figure with some problems, right?
Well, one of the things that complicates everybody in this story and largely in the region is the dense network of relationships. And, the fact is that, the Jamal has a cousin who's in Hamas. Well, that's totally true of so many people in Palestine. To know people who are, warriors for Hamas is pretty common. And it's not hard to find Hamas people. I didn't have much trouble when I was there. So you can have people that are advocates for peace, but also know the people that are complicating that pursuit.
And was it hard, Larry, for you in doing this research to really get a feel for both sides? I mean, often the criticism of many scholars is that we tend to know one side better than the other, and it's hard to penetrate the side that we don't have a connection to.
I think it's easier as a journalist who's not trying to specialize, but trying to, our general rule in journalism is you talk to everybody. And, as much as possible as that could be, you try to deal with all sides of an issue. And that's the journalistic model. And I think it's helped me in my career to understand other perspectives and to weigh the perspectives of one group of people versus another. If you're too invested in one perspective, then it's going to be hard for you to reach across the room and embrace the other.
And so how do you do that, though, as a journalist? How do you get people to open up to you, Larry?
You just be there. To start with, I always begin with, talking to people that I know have entered the news or something, people who dealt with the subject. And then I ask them, who else should I talk to? And they'll give me a list of names of people that I haven't heard of. And I go talk to them and continue the cycle until eventually I don't get any new names. And that's the way you populate the universe of the story that you're writing. And I call that the horizontal axis of reporting. But there's another axis, which is that some of those people are just more interesting, more candid, more available, and you go to them again and again. So it's more about the depth of understanding rather than the overall consensus.
That makes sense. And as you were writing this and bringing yourself repeatedly into the different parts of the war zone in a sense, how do you maintain your own safety? Because one of the points that comes through in the novel is how unsafe these areas are, how much is not just controlled by police forces, but often by paramilitary groups, and how dangerous it is.
Oh, Jeremy, when I'm in those situations, I try not to dwell on it. I know it's a kind of naive way of looking at things, but you can get paralyzed by the anxiety that you might face violence or you might be in a difficult situation. I'm cautious. After 9/11, I spent 5 years roaming around mostly the Arab world and South Asia. And it was a very, lonely experience. There weren't many Westerners in the region at all. And I felt conspicuous, but, I try to maintain a kind of friendly, posture and unthreatening. But basically, I found that most people want to have their story told. Most people think they're doing the right thing. Most people feel that if I could just find a sympathetic ear, I could get my story out. And I try to be that sympathetic ear without actually posing as a partisan.
That makes sense. Zachary?
Then what do you see the role of your fiction and your journalism in bringing those voices to light? What role do you play as a journalist in that mix?
Well, I try to do the same kind of research for fiction as I do for nonfiction because I think the reader wants the story to be plausible. And the kind of fiction I do is set in the context of real life and oftentimes in current time. So the reader is going to recognize if you happen to go off track somehow, and it will undermine their trust in your presentation. So I try to, I take notes, I interview people, I try to get as much in terms of language. I want to know what people actually said. I always feel much more confident if I can find the dialogue that I'm working with, the narration, and take it out of the reality that I've found it in and incorporate it in my fiction.
Do you think, Larry, that your background as an American, as someone who now lives in Austin, Texas, that this has affected the way you view the region?
Oh, no doubt. But, I think I had as a young man, I taught English in Cairo. And I was a conscientious objector, and this was my alternate service. I had 2 years teaching in Egypt, and I studied Arabic. I was never fluent, but I was a very parochial young man, and I thrown into a world that I didn't know, but I was very fond of my students, and it introduced me to the region. And after that, I went back a lot as a reporter. I wrote a movie called The Siege, about what would happen if terrorism came to America. And it was Islamic terrorism I was writing about, and this was in 1998. It came out 3 years before 9/11. And all of that influenced not just what I wrote about, but who I am. I became a person that is interested in the Middle East and in the tragedy and full of a sense of loss best way to explain it is every time I would get on an airplane and leave where I had been reporting, I was so grateful that I could leave and I could go to, this other reality, my home, and I would be free and I would have friends and I wouldn't be persecuted and I could trust the justice system, all those things, so it's so rare to find in the Middle East anyone who feels that sense of freedom.
Yes. I mean, it is interesting how you can see the region in a different way than those who are in it, of course, especially those who obviously have a very strong religious attachment to one point of view or another. I think you capture their world well, but of course that's not where you're coming from. How do you react to that, to those who would say, well, your depiction of the settlers who you depict, at least the ones in your novel, you depict them as pretty extreme and brutal and even corrupt. And then the brutality of Hamas. What would you say to someone who from one side or the other would say, well, we really believe that there is a religious right we have to this region, and we have the right to take this from the other side. I mean, there are people who seriously believe that, of course. What would your response be?
Well, if you were talking about the Jewish approach, you look at the Old Testament or the Torah, and the entry of Moses into the Holy Land. God gave the Promised Land to Moses on 2 occasions, although they're different sized gifts.
Yes.
He changed his mind somewhere along the line, and so that precedent really echoes. And then, of course, there's Joshua, who, when was directed by God to enter the Holy Land and kill every living thing. Well, if that is your commandment that you're living with, it's pretty terrifying. And then, the Quran agrees that God gave the Holy Land to the Jews, but then what happened is that God took that promise back because the Jews did not behave. So, there's that religion factor that I think is inseparable. But, the truth is, religion can be an ally in trying to make peace. And Camp David Agreement is I know you came to see my play in Houston, but making a peace between Israel and Egypt that Jimmy Carter brought Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to Camp David for 13 days, and they made peace. And this was a one-term governor of Georgia, Sadat, an assassin, and Menachem Begin, a terrorist. Those 3 men made peace, and it hasn't been tampered with a bit since they signed those papers in 1979. So, I'm always thinking about the fact that those men made peace. It must be possible for others to do so as well.
But I think, as your novel brings out, Larry, and your work on Camp David is wonderful. I've read many histories of the Camp David discussions, many of the original documents, but your play really brought out the characters, as I think we've talked about so well. But of course, the Palestinians were not part of those
represented.
negotiations.
No, yeah,
and so that I think the Palestinian argument would be that even in those cases, there's been peace among states, but not peace for them.
One of the things that I've wondered about, Jeremy, because I'm often asked, well, what do you think we should do? And I'm like, okay, it's up to me to find peace. One thing that is, it was a movement that seems to have died out, but other nations declaring Palestine as a state. Much of the world has done that. Asia, Africa, Latin America, U.S. and Europe stand apart from that. But I think I've kind of come to the conclusion that the Palestinians and the Israelis aren't capable of making peace themselves. They've had 77 years to do it, and they haven't been able to achieve it. So I think the world, through forceful diplomacy and maybe some wonderful carrots, rewards for making peace, some other initiative has to take place to spur the movement and peace on both sides.
I think that's dangerous, though, right? Because who defines what peace is then, right?
Well, yes, and I will stipulate, anyone who comes up with a plan to make peace in the Middle East is naive. And so I count myself in that. But if we continue down that road, we'll never have peace.
Right.
And I think whether one state or two or a confederation, anything is better than the continued occupation, which is so degrading to both cultures.
Yeah. I want to close with one more question, Larry, and I'm going to ask this question to you, and then I'm going to ask it to Zachary, because I know it's something he's thought about, and I think it's very relevant for young people, and we always like to close, as you know, our podcast with something that really connects to not just contemporary policy, which this obviously connects to, but to the concerns and interests, and hopefully the ways in which young people can help revitalize our democratic dialogue in the United States and elsewhere. You have, again, my favorite character, Sarah, in your novel earlier on, talking about what we might say is the pathology of suffering, how those who have suffered often inflict suffering on others. after their own suffering. And you have her saying, so much of Israel is a contradiction. Yes, it was a miracle, the salvation of the Jewish people, but in the process we have imposed our history on another people. With the ghettos, the diaspora, the pogroms, one victimized people subjugating another, helplessly unable to stop ourselves. There's a way in the novel in which you have the two sides, the settlers and the Palestinian Hamas supporters and Confederates. You have them sort of mirroring one another. My colleague Yoav DeCapo has written about this too. How in the conflict, the two sides start to mirror each other. Do you stand by that? Do you really think that's what's happened on the ground?
The mirroring?
Yes.
Yeah. I was very influenced by a couple of thoughts. David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the first prime minister and the second president of Israel, they were living in Manhattan in the turn of the 20th century, and they wrote a book about Israel. And Ben-Zvi was really kind of more the instigator, but he talked about how he would wander in Arab villages and he would see candles in the window on Friday night. He would see Hebrew in the cemeteries. And he came to the conclusion that the Palestinians were really the remnant of the original Jewish settlers in that region who had not been a part of the diaspora. And I thought that was a fascinating observation. And then DNA testing has pretty much confirmed that, both of these are very closely related peoples and both descended from the Canaanites. So when I went to Israel, I was doing a one-man show, and I thought, well, I'll tell them this, and this will solve the problem. and some people didn't believe it, and then others said, oh, yeah, we knew that. And that really stopped me. And I ran into this book that's been very influential in my thinking called The Need to Have Enemies and Allies by a Cypriot American psychiatrist named Vamek Volkan, who grew up in Cyprus, where Greeks and Turks, historical antagonists, lived. And they were very, very similar people. And they dressed the same with the same white tunic, although the Greeks would have the blue sash and the Turks would have the green one. And they each smoked different cigarettes. And these were the little tells that showed you, this is my enemy. And in Northern Ireland, the Protestants and the Catholics would paint their doors a different color.
Right.
And the Hutus and the Tutsis were so similar, they had to ask what tribe they were in before they killed each other.
Right.
And he remarked on Freud's observation about the narcissism of minor differences, that people who, like civil wars, are oftentimes much bloodier than other conflicts. And why is this? In Freud's ideas, it's some sort of projection of your own despised qualities that you're fighting against. And I don't know whether that's an accurate theory to work with, but it helps me understand that people who one would think should be friends, as they are in Brooklyn, sometimes fix on the smallest things that drive them separately. And it can lead to the worst traumas. And I think that's one of the factors we have in Israel and Palestine.
Zachary, does that resonate with you? I know you've thought about this a lot, particularly with your involvement with the Jewish community. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, I think so. I think one of the important points that we keep returning to on our podcast about the subject is, yes, this sort of similarity in the experiences. I think in some ways, though, that's what makes it so politically challenging to solve, is that the reality is that these two people want to live in similar ways on the same land, and political solutions are yet to be invented that can allow everyone to get what they want. And the challenge is that for so many, the stakes are personal, they're religious, they're political, and they seem often existential. I think it's important to remember that they're also human. And I think that's the power of fiction and of a novel like this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I thought, Larry, and I'm going to sneak in one final question here. I thought the relationship that you have in the novel between Sarah and Malak, one Jewish, one Muslim. I think it captures some of that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, things don't turn out that well, but you hope that people can find the humanity of each other, and if they can, then they can struggle to peace, and that's what happens with Sarah and Malak, is they find each other in this turbulent, bloody trauma that everybody is going through. They finally spot the other that they've been longing for.
Yes. Well, Larry, congratulations on your novel. I think it has done just what we were talking about. It humanizes this story. It takes these very difficult, quite frankly, depressing historical dynamics, and it really helps us. It certainly helps me as a reader to identify. And I think one of the key elements of democracy and democratic thinking is learning to humanize people who are different from all of us. And I think your novel does that, as only a great novel can. So congratulations, Larry.
Well, really. Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks, Zachary. I enjoyed chatting with you guys.
I want to encourage all of our listeners to pick up a copy of The Human Scale. It's available in all bookstores, and it is really a story worth reading. It is not the most uplifting story, but it is a compelling story, and I think it has something for everyone, even if you're not a Middle East specialist. Again, thank you, Larry. Zachary, thank you for your beautiful poem, as always, and for your questions. And thank you, most of all, to our loyal listeners and loyal subscribers to our Substack for joining us for this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Scott Holmes.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
See you next time.